Hi, I'm Ross Purnell, editor and publisher of Fly Fisherman magazine. Welcome to Loop, where we make deeper connections with the people behind the magazine. We are sponsored today by our friends at Patagonia. Patagonia has a new line of waders out called Swift Current. They have two different models, the Expedition and the Traverse. Both have zip front. The cool thing about these waders is that they're made without forever chemicals, it's a chemical called PFAS. They're the tiny little microparticles that get in our waterways and into the fish and into our blood. So if you're interested in keeping the waterways clean, or if you just want a really durable pair of waders, check out the Swift Current waders from Patagonia. We're also sponsored today by G. Loomis, American-made fly rods made in Woodland, Washington. I've been using G. Loomis rods for decades, really. One of my friends and mentors in the fly fishing business, Steve Rajeff, got me started on them, and today they're making amazing rods, the Asquith, the NRX, NRX Plus, IMX Pro. All of those models have places in my quivers. So if you enjoy this podcast, please support our sponsors, and you can support us by subscribing to the magazine. You can subscribe to Fly Fisherman, the print magazine, by going to our website, flyfisherman.com. There's a little link up in the top right-hand corner where you can subscribe. You can also support us by following us on social media. Our Instagram handle is at Fly Fisherman Magazine. On Facebook, we are at Fly Fisherman. And hopefully you're watching this program on our YouTube channel, at Fly Fisherman Magazine. Our guest today, we have the very great honor of having the legendary Joe Humphreys with us in our studios today. Joe is a legendary man. I first ran into Joe in a trip to Labrador over 20 years ago. And then he was an iconic person in the fly fishing business. He was a huge part of the Penn State fly fishing program. In fact, today, it's named the Joe Humphreys fly fishing program at Penn State, named after Joe. And yes, he's had an incredible influence on the sport of fly fishing worldwide. So thank you very much for joining us today, Joe.
Thank you for having me, Ross. It's a real pleasure, and I hope that I can do what you want me to do.
It's going to be fun. We're just going to sit and have a conversation, have a chat, maybe relive some old times, and I'm really looking forward to hearing some stories of the things you've accomplished, the people that you've met along the way. We just have a nice informal chat. I think one of the reasons I'm excited is because I met you in Labrador. We spent a week together fishing for big brook trout in Labrador. Colin McCowan was filming a TV show called The New Fly Fisher with the TV show is going. Colin unfortunately passed away last year.
Yes, he did. And he was such a good friend of mine. And we did 2 or 3 shows together, and I will miss him. And he had me in Ottawa to speak to a group, and it was a wonderful, wonderful thing that he did for me, and I so appreciated it.
So many things have happened in the last 20 years. So many things have changed, but one thing never changes, and that's you, Joe. You're like a rock, You're still out there.
96 years plus, I've been there, and I've seen a lot of things, and I've done a lot of things, and sometimes people will be telling me exactly, like on Penn's Creek, now if you fish this stretch, now you've got to know the waters, or you might be in trouble, or this, and I would say, son, I fished it before, and know every stretch that you're talking about long before you were born. So I'm okay. So I've had experiences on so many different streams and different places around the world. So my life, thank the good Lord for being so gracious and letting me experience so many wonderful things.
Wisdom fills in a lot of gaps, but you are truly a marvel. When I called you to ask if you could come on the cast, you had just been out teaching a group of students.
Yes, children, I think that might have been.
Yeah, fifth graders, you said.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I do that every year. And it's been, I think, maybe 30 years. And these little children are so wonderful. And one little boy, his father brought him along, and he was only a first grader. And his name was Adrian. And so he joined the class and with the casting. And then he said to me, he said, "Are we going on the stream today?" And I said, "Yes, Adrian, we will." And he says, "Would you like to catch a fish?" And I said, "Oh, I would like to catch a fish." "Well, this is what you're going to have to do." Here's a 6-year-old telling the old man exactly how to catch a fish. He says, "You're going to have to use a woolly bugger." And he said, "You're going to have to fish it down and across the stream, and you're going to have to fish it real slow if you want to catch a fish." And I said, "Well, thank you, Adrian." And I was on the stream, and I had all these children behind me, and I missed a fish. And so I said to the children, "I just missed a fish." And I said, "I will fish on through, and then I'll come back and see if I can catch that fish." So I fished on through, and I came back, and I said to the children, "Now I'm going to see if I can catch the fish that I missed." And I was about ready to make a cast, and little Adrian reached up and grabbed my hand. And he said, "This time, set the hook." So God love his heart. Here's a 6-year-old, a first grader, telling the old man, "Yes, this time set the hook." So I never forgot that. I thought that was so clever, so humorous. Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing that you're still out teaching the kids after all these decades. I mean that's got to be your greatest legacy as a teacher and a coach. A lot of people can be good fly fishermen, but it takes a special kind of person to be a good teacher and exert that influence for good on generations of people.
Well, I love these children, and I remember on one demonstration, I raised a fish and hooked another one, but I didn't land him. And so that afternoon, after I went home, I called the lady that was responsible for all the children, and I said, "Now, how did they do on the stream today?" And, well, one little girl got 3, and another little boy got 2, and another little girl got 2. And I said, "Good heavens, these kids are out fishing me." So
you taught them well.
I taught them well, yeah.
Well, while we're on the subject of children, why don't we start our conversation by talking about when you were a child?
Yes, and
like that's a good starting point,
I would like
right?
to lead in with the story of my first trout.
Okay.
So this was below what they call the rock, and this is on Spring Creek. And there's a little island below the rock, and it's still there today. And there was a road that came down, and it's no longer there. And this was back in the 1930, I think 36, no, maybe 39. It's back in the 30s. And I was only 6 years old. And my father got me this rod, and we have a picture of me holding it. And the rod was made by the Union Hardware Company in Tomington, Connecticut. And I'm sure that today the rod is no longer made, and but back then, that was my first rod, and I was thrilled to have it. And so, fishing season and then opened up at 5 o'clock in the morning. It was still dark, and my father had never fished, and only when he was on the farm in Curvensville, Pennsylvania, where he was raised. And when they had maybe heavy rains and they couldn't farm, and they couldn't even pick stones in the field, he had a long bamboo rod with string attached to it and a hook, and he would get grasshoppers and fasten a grasshopper on the hook, and he went to the bridge that crossed the Susquehanna, West Branch of the Susquehanna, and when he was a boy, there were schools of bass and other fish, and he caught 2 or 3 bass on grasshoppers, and that's the only fishing he ever did. So we were on Spring Creek, and on this side of the island, the stream was much smaller, and so it was still dark. We had a can of worms, and with flashlights we found, I put a worm on my hook, and though I was clumsy, I did get the worm in the water, and I felt some tugs, and I instinctively pulled, and a fish came out of the water over my head, dropped off the hook into the weeds behind me. And I searched around and I couldn't find the fish, and all at once I saw the weeds moving, and I found the fish, and it was an 8-inch brown trout. And meanwhile, my father, with a kingfisher rod, a bamboo, hooked a fish and threw the rod down, grabbed the line, and hand over hand pulled the fish in. And it was a foot-long brown trout. So we were so proud of our fish, and there were so many fish on the fishermen. And back then, we're talking in the 30s, Spring Creek was lined with fishermen back then. And so we proudly displayed our fish. And I took that fish home, and my mother put it in a pan, and I admired it, the beautiful spots, the red spots, the orange spots, halos around some of them. And such a beautiful little fish that was. And my mother cooked it for me, made a trout sandwich. And I think it was the best sandwich I've ever had. So, and still, it's one of my favorite sandwiches. So that's the way it was back in the 30s, and that started me. Once I hooked that fish, I was hooked on fishing. And so my life as a child consisted of, as I was growing, 3 peanut butter sandwiches, a jug of milk, fly rod across the handlebars of my bicycle, a little plastic container with flies. In my flies, I was fishing, and I would pedal to Spring Creek, to Thompson Run, to the mountain streams. I would pedal that bike everywhere. And so, and my favorite times of fishing would be, for instance, on Thompson Run, I would be there early in the morning, and the dew was still on the grass. And I had bib overalls, and I would crawl up to the stream because I didn't want to disturb the fish. And there was a little springs trivlet that came into the Thompson Run were one of my favorite places. And I would crawl up, and my bib overalls would be soaked, because of the wet dew. And then I could watch where that little spring seep came in. There were several trout in a little school of them. And I learned so much from just observing them. I saw where the big ones were and where the little ones were. And the little ones were always away from the big ones because they didn't want to end up inside of the big ones. So there was a pecking order, and I observed these things as a child, and I could see where the trout would lie and position themselves to feed. And so it was a wonderful learning experience, just being observant.
And to anchor this in a time and place, you were born in 1929, correct?
Yes.
So all of this is happening in the 30s,
30s
like
and early
1935.
40s.
You were 6 years old.
Yeah.
And this is in the middle of the Great Depression.
Yes.
You're riding a bicycle with your bamboo fly rod.
Yes.
What an amazing period of time.
And then World War II came and into the 40s, and gasoline was rationed, and there were very few people or cars on the road, and very few fishermen. And so I had like Spring Creek or these mountain streams, I had them practically to myself. And it was such a wonderful experience. And so I remember one time fishing Spring Creek, and I was sitting down, I think, eating a peanut butter sandwich, taking a little rest break, and an elderly man came down and sat down beside me. And so I said to him, "Sir," I said, "when you were a boy like me, did you fish this stream?" He says, "Yes, I did, son." And I said, "Well, did you catch some big brown trout?" And he said, "No, son." He said, "Spring Creek had nothing but brook trout." And so all of Spring Creek and all of the streams around had no brown trout, only brook trout. And I read in Theodore Gordon's book at the end of the 1800s, he was challenged by a fisherman in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, where the big springs come into Spring Creek. And he challenged Theodore Gordon to a fishing contest because he thought that he was the best fisherman. Well, Theodore Gordon came to Bellefonte, and he outfished the Bellefonte hero. And so I don't know how many brook trout they caught. They were like 50-some brook trout, and the local Bellefonte hero caught 40-some, and so Theodore Gordon beat him. But they kept all of those trout. What they did with them, who knows? They probably threw them away. But thinking of Spring Creek, as I know it, there were very few brook trout. There were a few, and where the big springs, like the big spring, the Benner Spring, that is feeding the hatchery today. It's the forget which hatchery, but the major hatchery, and the big spring, they piped it, but then it flowed into Spring Creek. And where it dropped into Spring Creek, there were brook trout because that water was so cold. And down below, there were a series of little pockets. And when I would fish wet flies down through there, I could always catch a brook trout. So lots of times I would pedal down to where that big spring came in, and with wet flies, I could catch maybe 2 or 3 brook trout. And they would be like 7 to maybe 8 or 9 inches, and they were prizes to me. And so I would take them home, and that was for the pan. So
pretty special fish.
Yeah, it was special fish. But I was just thinking, Spring Creek today, they stock brook trout, and you might find a brook trout where a spring enters, but there are very few brook trout today. And then I think about the years back in the 30s or before, when there was nothing but brook trout. And that's kind of hard to believe.
Different time.
And so I said to the old man, and I said, "Well, Did you ever catch any big brook trout? Were there some big fish? And he says, well, yes, son. He says, I would catch one maybe 2 or 3 pounds. 2 or 3 pound brook trout? Good heavens, you're talking about a 20 some inch brook trout. So there were some mighty big, healthy native brook trout, yes, back in those days.
So if your dad wasn't much of a fisherman, certainly not a fly fisherman, who was your mentor? Like, how did you learn this stuff?
My father became addicted to it also, and so he would take his son fishing. But before my dad, even while my dad was really into it, and he loved to fish flies, wet flies, and for whatever reason, and I think it was the name of the fly, and the colorful makeup of the fly was the Parmesan bell, and for some reason he just loved that fly. And sometimes on the stream I would say, Dad, I'm doing very well with this fly. I'm fishing a sulfur wet fly, and I think you should fish it because I'm catching fish. And he said, no, Joe, I'll just fish the Parmesan bell. So he was in love with that fly. But anyhow, he did fish other flies, and he did catch fish. But when I was a young lad, there was a man that lived across the street, and his name was Clyde Scheffler. And he was an old man, and he was very frail, and he was physically having troubles back in those days. But I would go over and sit on his porch swing with him, and he would be rolling a cigarette, and I could remember the tobacco falling down from his pack of tobacco on his shirt while he was rolling his cigarette. And he would be telling me about fishing wet flies on Spring Creek. And he told me several times about the 17-inch brook trout or brown trout that he caught above Oak Hall on Spring Creek and above the railroad trestle. And I heard that story several different times. And so one day we were sitting on the porch, and he was telling me about fishing wet flies. And all at once he said to me, would you like to go fishing with me? And I was thrilled. And I didn't take a fishing rod or any fishing equipment. I just went with him. And so we went to the second railroad trestle down below Oak Hall. There was a nice deep hole and a nice piece of water. And he stringed up his bamboo fly rod, and I was in awe of the rod itself. The bamboo rod was about 9 foot long, and it shook as he walked with it, and all these things were just embedded in my mind. And I saw him make a cast, and I saw him catch fish. And at the time, he had 2 Quill Gordons for his flies. And he caught 2 trout when I was watching him fishing wet flies, and he was explaining what he was doing and how he was fishing them. And so he gave me those 2 fish. He laid them on the grass, and I thought they were beautiful, and they were both about a foot long, and he gave me those fish to take home. But that was a wonderful experience for me, because then I wanted to fish wet flies like he did. And so I became a wet fly fisherman, and I fished dries and wets or whatever that I could catch a fish with. But those memories really stayed with me, and I remember fishing. It was on Spring Creek. It was above what they call the Big Rock, and there was a dam there. And there was a gentleman had waded out in that dam, and I was on the shore, and I fished down by him. And after I fished by him, I turned around and watched him, and he was catching fish. And I thought, wow, I didn't catch any fish, but he's catching fish. So I went back up and talked to him, and I said, "Sir," I said, "you're catching fish." And he said, "Yes, son, I am." And I said, "What are you fishing?" And he said, "I'm fishing wet flies." Well, I said, "You can't be fishing wet flies because I'm fishing wet flies. And I fished right down by you." And I said, "I didn't catch any fish, so you can't be catching fish with wet flies." And he says, "Yes, I am, son." He said, "These fish don't want the flies swinging down over them. They want a perfect natural drift. So I'm casting straight upstream with a straight line, and as it comes back to me, when it stops, I hook a trout."
Wow. So this is
So
like the very
he
first
said,
time you learned about nymphing.
Yeah, well, it was fishing wet flies. And he said, they want the wet flies on a natural drift, coming back to them naturally, not dragging in front of them. So that's what I did. I learned that lots of times when fishing wet flies, if they're not taking your flies and you see fish moving on top, fish wet flies straight upstream. And I have as 3 flies on the leader. My top fly is a Royal Coachman, and it's very visible to me. And so I watch the Royal Coachman in the water because of its visibility. And when it stops or moves and has a jerk or a touch, and then I know I'm into a fish. And so, because those flies are just under the water and there's no obstructions to catching them. And so I've learned to fish wet flies straight upstream. And so this was one of my lessons in life on how to fish the wet fly. And then another time, I was down below the rock, and I had bicycled down, and I crawled up behind a guy, and his name was Clyde Fox, I think it was. And he was fishing wet flies, and he had a dropper and a fly below the dropper. And then he had the dropper, about a 4-inch or maybe longer dropper, and the top fly was making a disturbance with it on the surface. He was bouncing the dropper of the wet fly on the surface. And he was taking trout because that wet fly imitated a fly coming off the water and hatching maybe off the water. And so I learned from this gentleman from Houtsdale, Pennsylvania, another way to fish wet flies. Bounce that dropper and keep it moving and attract fish that way. So I've learned from so many people.
It's fascinating about the way you learn, because now, kids that age just look it up on YouTube and they can quickly and easily and see and learn it. But you had to be on the stream watching other people and talking to other people and sort of learning for yourself, or else learning very organically.
Yes. And the trout were my greatest teachers because I'm observing these fish and how they were feeding and what they were doing gave me a lot of insights on how to fish for them and where they were and how to cover the water. And I learned so much from the trout themselves. And so I think that when when I observed fish and they were feeding, I was on Thompson Run, the tributary coming into Spring Creek, which was one of my favorite haunts. And every time I went there, I observed this one fish, and he was a healthy brown trout, a sizable brown trout. And he was positioned with his chin just behind a rock, and I would see him move out from the rock and grab something and come back. And he always came back to the same position, and he would move again and get something. And I had no idea what he was feeding on. So I would make a cast, and my casts were clumsy, and I would spook the fish. And when my fly line hit the water or my leader hit the water, he would disappear for a while, and then he'd come back. And I was so frustrated and said, I've got to know what he's feeding on. So one day I waded into the stream, grabbed a handful of weeds, and the weeds were just alive. And then I didn't know what they were, but they were alive with freshwater shrimp. And so I took a couple of these shrimps home, and I tied what I thought looked like them. And there was a little bit of orange on them, and I found some thread in my mother's sewing box that looked like it. And so with some materials I gathered that I tied what I thought looked pretty good, but it wasn't. And so I made a cast. I went back to the stream. There that trout was, and there he was, again feeding, moving. And I made the cast, and again he disappeared. And so I went back home, and I found some fox fur. And I spun that on the hook, and I pulled the longer fibers down. And I had a little tail of dyed breast feathers. They were dyed brown, and I had that for the tail. And so the pulled down fibers of that fox fur, and it was on smaller hooks back. And then those days, the smallest one I had was probably I think a 14. And so with this fly, I went back, and here that same trout was. And I made a cast, and this time, instead of running, he came after that fly, and he followed it for a distance, and he grabbed it, and I hooked the fish and flipped him out on the bank, and he was 14 inches long, and I threw him in my basket and my bicycle, and I pedaled home singing at the top of my voice. I was so happy that I finally captured that fish. And when I got home, my mother took a picture of that fish, me holding it up. And I thought,
wow,
I still have that picture. And it was a wonderful experience.
You have a long history of hunting specific fish. Yes. And I mean, what an accomplishment for a kid to like, look what's in the weeds, tie an imitation. Like you basically taught yourself how to match the hatch.
Yes. And
what an amazing beginning.
Yes. And so
well, I wanted to talk about your role at Penn State, for sure. You're Mr. Penn State. Penn State had the original accredited fly fishing program in the entire country. Penn State has a huge fly fishing tradition since 1934 or 36.
Back in the 30s, I think.
Yeah, when you were a little kid.
Back at around 1932 or 33, when George Harvey met the dean of agriculture, Dr. Watts, and he met him on Spring Creek, and George had a basket full of trout. And Dean Watson, they were fishing Spring Creek, and this was the first day of trout season. And George dumped a basket of trout out in front of the dean. when he was on the stream, and Dean says, "I've never seen a catch like that in all my life." And George says, "Well, these aren't the big ones." And he reached back in his fishing vest and brought out 3 fish over 18 inches long. And Dean Watts says, I've got to learn teach me." And so George helped him with wet fly on that pool, and Dean Watts caught a couple of brook trout on wet flies that day, and he was so excited. And he said, "The flies," he said, "do you tie these flies?" And George says, "Yes." And so he says, "Will you teach me to tie?" And George says, "Yes." And so that's how the first class started. He taught Dean Watts how to tie flies. And Dean Watts says, "Other people would like to see this. My friends and students and anybody will advertise it, and we'll have a class." And so that was how the first class began.
How Penn State got started, the Penn State fly fishing program.
Yeah.
Now the Penn State fly fishing program is called the Joe Humphreys fly fishing program, named in your honor.
We're going to go back a ways.
Yeah, I'm dying to know how you first met George Harvey.
I was on Spring Creek, and it was a section of Spring Creek. It's long gone now. They called it the Sawmill Stretch, and the prison grounds were there, and that's where they made materials to build with, I guess, on the Sawmill Stretch, whatever. But this stretch of water, I was fishing, and I was fishing a snelled wet fly, and it was coming apart. So there was a fisherman standing there, and I said, "Sir, can you help me with this? My fly's coming apart, and I don't know how to fix it." He says, "No, son," he says, "I can't help you." But he says, "There's a man up there. That guy's George Harvey up there." And he says, he says, "He's a good fisherman, and he might help you." So I went up, and I said, "Sir," I said, "my fly's coming apart." And at that time, George was catching fish after fish. And there was a sulfur hatch on. I didn't know what a sulfur hatch was then, but there was a sulfur hatch on, and George was just catching fish after fish. And he stopped fishing, and he looked at my fly, and he fixed the fly for me. He put it back together the best he could so I could fish with it. And that's when I first met George Harvey. I didn't know who he was. And then later on, I would be fishing Spring Creek, and back in those years, and George would be fishing Spring Creek. He would be maybe on one side of the stream, I'd be on the other, and he would fish by me, and he would acknowledge me, but he never stopped. And back in those days, fishermen that were the best in the business, they didn't share. They didn't tell anybody anything. Their progress, their secrets, their techniques were their own, and they didn't want to tell anybody about them. So that's the way it was back in those days. And so he never shared with me, but fished on by me. And so I remember one time being later on in life, there was a place in Lemont. It was a butcher shop. And they had a pipe that they pushed all the stuff that from their butchery into this pipe and right into Spring Creek. All kinds of guts and all kinds of blood. And lo and behold, these trout big trout would come right up to that pipe because they were eating all that stuff coming out of that damn pipe, out of that butcher shop. And so I was at I forget where it was, but I was downtown, and I ran into George, and we were talking about night fishing. And he said, I know where there's a place where there's a lot of big trout. And he says, I'm going to take you there, and I'm going to show you these fish. So he took me there at that night with a flashlight, and there they were. All these big fish were lined up over that pipe. And he said, now I'm going to show you the fly. And he says, I never showed anybody this fly. And you've got to promise me that you can use it, but you got to promise me you will never tell anybody. And I said, I promise I won't. And so George gave me his night fly. And so I went back at night after those fish. And they weren't really interested in George's night fly. They wanted all that stuff coming out of that pipe. But later on, I did catch one fish who went 19 inches from that group on George's fly. So, yeah.
What was the fly like?
That was a big fly, had the wings tied out to the side, facing forward, and the water currents would make them move, and they moved with the currents, and he had a pretty heavy body on the fly, dubbed fur, and a heavy head hackle, but the movement of those big wings, and the wings that he had on were loon feathers, which were illegal. Bet that's what George used. And so he gave me an old loon hide that he had, and I had still some of those feathers on it that were usable. And so that's what I tied my first big George Harvey wet flies with. But then I didn't want to, because it was illegal, I didn't want to continue. So I found out later on, and what I use now are ringneck feathers from the flanks, and they work very well. And I think it looks like a crayfish.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a big meat fly.
Yeah, and I took the Pennsylvania record on a pair of them. I was fishing a pair of those big wood flies when I took the Pennsylvania record.
We have the picture sitting right there beside you. Mm-hmm. I'd love to hear the story of you getting the Pennsylvania state record. I mean, that is a legendary fish.
That is a legendary fish. I never dreamed that a fish could be that big. But that fish, after I caught it, and they took a scale sample of it, and they said the fish, the first 4 years of its life was in a hatchery, and then he escaped from the hatchery and lived in Fishing Creek in a big long stretch of water below the hatchery. And one night I was down fishing, and I heard a terrific bust in the water. I thought maybe a deer had jumped in the water, but there weren't any deer. It had to be a fish. And George Harvey said that he and his friend were down there fishing, and they saw a huge fish. And he told me where it was, and on that stretch. And he said, if I were going to fish for that fish, he says, I wouldn't fish down. And I was then fishing for it. And I was fishing, there was a fallen tree in the water, and that's where that fish lived. And so I fished from that tree on down to where the pool emptied out. And George says, he said, if I were fishing for that fish, he said, I would fish up in the riffles, because at night in the riffles, crayfish are active. And not only that, but he said, at night your hatches are in the riffles. They're active. And he said, so the riffles are where the activity is. The whole food chain comes alive in the riffles. And he said, and on the far side of that riffle, there's a patch of dead water. And he said, that's where a bunch of suckers live, and they're laying down in there. And he said, they're easy for a big fish to trap. And so he said, that's where I'd go. So that's where I went. And so one night, my telephone rang, and it was Al Hagg. And Al and I were teaching at Bald Eagle area, and he was the guidance counselor. And he said, he said, I'm sick of watching television. And he said, why don't you go fishing tonight? He said, and I'll go along, and I just like to watch you fish. And he says, I got to get out and get some exercise. He says, why don't you fish? And I said, okay. And there was a very light rain. It was just a mist almost. And so I went to this patch of water. So I drove to Fishing Creek with Al, and I fished up through, and I caught a pretty nice fish, about 19 inches, and he was really excited. And so then I went up to the riffles, and I had a pair of George Harvey's night flies on, and these were tied with the pheasant feathers, and I made a cast across to that slow backwater, and as I pulsated the flies across, I moved them with just a touch of the rod tip. I'd wait, touch the rod tip, and the flies would move, and they would move, and they move, and all at once they stopped, and the rod went straight down, and I hooked this fish, and it was like a wash tub turning over in the water. It was huge explosion. And that fish raced for that dead tree that had fallen in the water. And somehow I stopped him just before he got to the tree. And I turned him. And it's lucky I had heavy enough leader on with those flies, because night fishing, you don't have to worry about them ever seeing the leader or being leader shy. You go with as heavy as you can get away with. Mm-hmm. And I think I had OX or 13 thousandths or something very heavy. And I turned that fish, and I got him back up, and my rod got up, caught into the hemlocks overhead, and I flipped my flashlight on to see where it was, and when the light hit the water, he took off, and he almost made the tree again before I got him stopped. And I got the rod out of the tree, and I got him back in front of me, and that fish was so damn big, I didn't have a net, and a net wouldn't have done any good anyhow. And so I got him in front of me, and I jumped in the water and got both arms under him, and I threw him up on the back. And Al and I were down on our knees and looking at that fish, and Al said to me, he says, I've never seen a fish that big. And I said, neither have I, Al. That's the biggest fish I've ever seen. And so we took the fish, and on the way home, we stopped at the Nittany Bar. And this guy, the bartender, was always telling me about big fish and the big fish he caught. And so I went into the bar, and I said, if I show you a fish that's bigger than anything you ever caught, I get a free drink. And he says, well, let me see the fish. And so I took it in and laid it on the bar. He didn't say anything. He just broke out a glass for me and a glass for Al and started to pour. He said, I've never seen a fish this big. And so on the way home, the fish warden, Anilowski, we stopped there. And I got him out, and this is at 4 in the morning, and I got him out of bed. And he says, I've got to show you this fish. He says, you got me out of bed at 4 in the morning to show me some damn fish. And I said, yes, you've got to see this fish. And so I took the fish in. He measured it and weighed it on what he had on the scales. And he said, the record was on length then because people were cheating with weight. They were doing all kinds of things, loading fish with lead and all that stuff. So they went by length. And he said, you got the new record by an inch. He says, you've got the new state record. So then I took it home, put it in the bathtub, and then the next morning we got some photographs. And
so that photo was taken the next morning.
And that night we got some photographs. I called a friend of mine, Paul Blankenhorn, and I said, bring your camera. I said, I got this fish and I need photos, and I think it's a record fish. And so Paul Blankenhorn came that night and took the photos of that fish. Yeah.
Wow. And at that time, you were a wrestling coach at Bald Eagle High School?
I was the wrestling coach at Bald Eagle. I was a teacher and a wrestling coach, yeah. Mm-hmm.
A lot of people don't know that you're not only in the Fly Fishing Hall of Fame, but you're in the National Wrestling Hall of Fame because you were a wrestling coach for high school and you became a wrestling coach at Penn State.
Yeah, I've had such an extensive wrestling career in high school. I lost in what they call now the regional finals, but I lost to the state champion and by a couple of points. And but I think my record was my senior year in high school was 14-1, and I was pretty good. And then in 1948, I went to the Middle Atlantic AEUs and as a 147-pounder and 18 years of age, I think. And I took second in the tournament, and I lost to a kid from Penn University in the finals. And then I went on to the Olympic trials in 1948, and they were held at Rutgers University. And I was beaten by a kid still in high school that then went on to Penn State and was a very successful wrestler at Penn State. So I had back in those days, and then I joined the Navy, and I went to Pensacola, and I was on an aircraft carrier. But Pensacola had a wrestling team, and I tried out for it, and I beat a kid. His name was, I'll never forget his name. His name was Raskob. He had wrestled for Minnesota, and I beat him out for the team. And so I wrestled with the Pensacola pre-flight, and we wrestled a kind of a collegiate schedule. I wrestled against Northwestern University and against Millersville in Pennsylvania and so many other places we went. And so I was with Pensacola pre-flight, and I had kind of a collegiate schedule back then. And then I went to the All-Navy Championships, and I placed in an All-Navy Championships, and they kept me at Annapolis, and I trained with the Navy team, and they were going to send me to the Nationals, but then I had to go back to the ship. But they wanted me there to wrestle for Navy, and then my enlistment was up, and I went to Penn State, and I said I had enough Navy. There's no more 4 more years of Navy for me. So Charlie Spidell, the wrestling coach at Penn State, says, you're going to wrestle for Penn State. And so then I began to wrestle for Penn State. And I wasn't a great wrestler. I have a 500 record, baby. I beat some good boys. I beat some kids from different universities, Columbia, Maryland, Syracuse, Ohio State. I beat a lot of good boys.
Penn State's a powerhouse at wrestling.
And now Penn State is the powerhouse.
Yes.
They've been winning the Nationals for the last several years. And Cale Sanderson is just a wonderful coach, and his coaching staff with Cunningham and his brother is also a coach of And so they have a wonderful coaching staff, and they've kept a lot of wrestlers from the past, and other major universities like Dake from Cornell is now helping them, and who is a national champion and a great wrestler in his own right. But they have a wonderful system.
So you were already deeply involved in the Penn State wrestling program.
Yes.
How did that evolve into you taking the reins of the fly fishing program?
When George Harvey brought me in and to the wrestling into Penn State from Baldwin area in 1970, the wrestling coach Bill Cole said, and he was also instrumental in getting me, along with Charlie Spidell, getting me into Penn State. And so for 2 years, I was an assistant wrestling coach to Bill Cole. And Bill Cole, I've got to give you a little background on this wrestling coach. Bill Cole was wrestled for Iowa State Teachers College. Now it's Northern Iowa. And he had a record of 75-0. Nobody ever beat him. Nobody ever took him down. Nobody ever rode him for a minute. He was amazing. And so he won the Nationals 3 straight times in a row. And then he was coaching at Northern Iowa. And then he came to Penn State. And then I learned more in 1 week under Bill Cole. He was such a knowledgeable coach. It's so much on techniques were wonderful. And so I coached with him for 2 years. And then I decided that, and then I was in the angling program. I'd taken, George Harvey brought me in to take over the angling program. And George said, I'm going to be in one class with you. And he said, I will never come to another class because you have the angling program. Now you take it over and you run it. And so for 19 years then, I ran the angling program at Penn State. And it was such a wonderful experience for me. And I went and I got some aid, not only from the university, I didn't get that much aid, but from Alcoa and from Exxon, I got money, and I get several $1,000s. I think I ended up with $23,000 in grants, and I had enough money to keep the program going, and then I brought in, after the 19 years, I brought in a guy by the name of Vance McCullough. He took it over, and then ensuing after him, he was there for 7 years, I think, and then I forget who took over for him, but the program is now under George Daniels, and I brought George in, and he has done an outstanding job, and I'm so proud of George and what he has done, and he's brought the course up, and he has a young lady teaching one section for him, and so the course, and with the money we have brought in now, the course is guaranteed for eternity. And I am so pleased and so proud. And when I pass on from this earth, and at 96, I don't have too many more years, but when I pass on from this earth, I will know that the angling course will always be there.
It's in good hands. George Daniel is an amazing fly fishing mind, an amazing teacher. Yes. He learned from good people. He learned from a good person.
And he learned from me. So
yeah.
I had him in my backyard when he was 60 years old, when only 16. And I took him out into the mountains. I took him different places, but he learned so fast. And then he became so good. And I think he won maybe he won the world championships. Or I forget what he did, but as he grew in age, he grew in experience, he grew in knowledge, and he became, and now today, a wonderful teacher. And like I say, I'm so proud.
Good person to lead the Joe Humphreys fly fishing program.
You bet.
And now an anonymous donor has donated, I think, $250,000 to the program to keep it going forever.
And we're still seeking aid. We would like another $1 million. Another $1 million would guarantee the programs.
There's no other fly fishing program like it at a university in the world.
There are other universities that have angling in their program, but not like Penn State. No.
And this is the first one, and doing an amazing job. Yes. While we're talking about George took an amazing photo of you. You're on the cover of our August-September issue. I don't think you've seen this before. This is not the actual magazine, but that's a proof of the upcoming cover.
That is so wonderful. I am so pleased, and I thank you, Ross, for thinking of me and doing this. And it's a major honor, and I'm in awe, and I'm basically now I'm speechless. Yes.
Well, it's an honor to have you on there. This is all subscribers will get this in the mail July 1st. So it's amazing to have you on the cover.
Oh God!
Legendary fly fisherman.
Oh wow. Well, cool. Legendary, I think a legend means you're old, and that's what I am. I'm old. So
but a lot of the things that the people talk about as new today or whatever, you were doing it 40 or 50 years ago. You know what I mean? I looked it up today. You wrote 10 articles for Fly Fisherman magazine over the years. One of them in 1983 was about monofilament nymphing.
Yes.
About how to use thin, weighted flies and, thin diameter line to get down and catch big trout. It's called Euro nymphing now, but
yes. Well, let me tell you a story. There were the Kerstetters. They were born and raised on Penn Creek, and there were 14 of them. Children lived in this one cabin. I don't know how they existed, but when the Kerstetter family finally gave up the cabin, they found jar after jar of canned trout. They lived on trout. The Kerstetter, Butch Kerstetter and Lester Kerstetter were minnow fishermen, and they were deadly. And so they used fly rods. And with monofilament, they would make a cast, hold the rod high, let the minnow settle, and then start to work it back. And they caught, I have a picture of Lester Kerstetter with trout on the fly rod. The smallest one's 18, the biggest one's 29. I think there's 10 or 12 fish on that fly rod on a butt section, and the butt section's bent. There's so many big fish. They were amazing. And Lester Kerstetter had a canister that he had straps on his back with his canister. And when he'd catch a fish, he'd fill it with water, throw the fish in the canister, and take it home. And in front of their cabin, they built with stone you might say, a trap. and all the big fish they would catch, they would put in
the creek.
in the creek.
Oh, yeah.
And then if somebody wanted a big fish, they would give them a big fish for $25 or $20 or whatever. That's how they made some money. They sold some of those big fish to people that wanted to take a big fish home, you know.
They had a cabin right on Penn's?
Right on Can. It's still there.
Oh, really?
Denny
Wow.
Shannon is now. It's Denny Shannon's cabin. He bought it. And so Lester Kerstetter, I learned from him. And I fished like he did with live minnows. And then I didn't like fishing live bait. I wanted to fish flies. So I took the mono and set a system up with nymphs. And then I could, with mono, it sunk so fast, I could get down faster in deeper water like I never could with a fly line. And so I began to fish with all mono. And so this is how I learned it from the Kerstetters and the live minnow men. And so then I had a lot of success rolling the bottom with a pair of nymphs, sometimes stoneflies, sometimes hatchwise green drake nymphs, sometimes with sulfur nymphs, but I caught a hell of a lot of fish rolling the bottom.
Yeah, getting deep.
Getting down deep, adjusting the weights, and thinking about fishing and talking about fishing. You know, that my advice to a lot of people would be, one of the things you have to have when you go on a stream, you have to have line control. You have to be able to control the line. And then you have to be able to judge the stream you're fishing, how fast the currents are, how deep you have to go. And then you have to learn to not only adjust your leader for this, but adjust the weights that are going to get you down there. And sometimes you can do it with a weight on a fly. And today they use heads on a fly like a tungsten or a bead head fly. Back in my day, we didn't have any beads, or we didn't have any tungsten heads. We just put some lead in the fly if you wanted it to sink. And there was just different ways I would lead the flies, and I would flatten them. And I found out through experimentation that if I could flatten the nymph and put the hackles out to the side, a clump of fibers out to both sides, the fly would rock in the water. And the rocking motion was deadly insofar as catching fish. And so I learned all of these things through observation and through trial and error. When you're fishing, one of the things you want to have an open mind, and you want to be able to think these things through. So when you go onto the water, how deep and how fast it is and how much weight do you have to have in the fly, or if you don't have any weight in the fly, with split shots, you adjust your weights and to get you down there to fish the bottom with a long drift, to give you as much time down there as naturally as you can to get that drift on the bottom to catch fish. And so this is one of the things I would advise people. Learn to adjust your leaders for the depth you're fishing. You might have to not only adjust the tippet, but adjust the sections in the middle. You might go from 17 to 15 in 13 thousandths. You might say, whoa, I need another section of 13 thousandths, or I'll take that off and lengthen that section of 13 thousandths and then adjust that way. But the currents and the waters tell you how deep or how shallow you have to go. Lots of times you don't need any weight. Lots of times your cast is not a tuck cast or a downer or an upper to get the nymphs down, but you shoot in only inches of water, shoot it straight upstream and straighten it right out because you don't need depth. You only are in inches of water. So for the streams you're fishing, for the depths you're fishing, you always are adjusting. So this is what I would tell the people with line control. And then the adjustments to water you're fishing. So
Adjusting your leader and adjusting your cast too. You
And
just
your
mentioned
cast.
the tuck cast.
Yeah.
I mean, that's when I was a kid and I was just reading Fly Fisherman. I read your article in Fly Fisherman about the tuck cast and started
with
to bring that into
with
my
weight,
own repertoire.
With weight in the flies and the leader, and you stop the rod high, and then that weight will go forward and then tuck, drop. Because when you stop the rod high, I do it, I squeeze the rod and give it a squeeze, and I stop it suddenly, up high, up there, and then the cast will go this way and tuck and drop. And now I have the flies settling on the bottom, and I have the line from the flies back to me in a straight line, and I watch that line, and when it stops, I strike. It could be at the bottom, but it could be a fish.
In the background, we've got books. Can you tell me about the books you've made over the years? Do you enjoy the process of creating a book, or is it kind of a labor of love?
Well, it's something I felt that I should do. I felt that I had some things to say, and so I wrote the book, and I, and over the years, like with wet flies, I remember fishing a mountain stream, and I had a friend with me at Boy Scout camp. There was a little stream that fed the dam there, and a kid by the name of Donnie Crumrine, and I had a fly rod and wet flies, and he was with me, and we crawled up to this pool, and I made a cast with the wet flies, and the trout kind of scooted. I alarmed them, and then I just let the flies settle, and I let them lay on the bottom. And then when I picked them up, the trout grabbed them. But going the cast and the fly settling, no, the trout were alarmed. But once those flies settled and I let them lay, when I picked them up slowly, that's when I caught fish. So I learned by doing. I learned by fishing. And this is what you do when you're fishing. Experiment. Try things. If they work, they work. Lots of times you just you might add weight to your fly, to your leader, even with wet flies, and let them lay down on the bottom, and then slowly bring them up. That's a technique that works. I learned it on that little mountain stream. And so many times with other fishermen, like I told you, the gentleman on Spring Creek, as a child, I learned to fish straight upstream because the fish like a natural drift at times. And so all of these things you learn from others, but you go also, like I did, you learn by doing. I fished a mountain stream. I loved fishing mountain streams. But my techniques with bait fishing, I would use a flip cast just to get the worm into the water, and then I would strip out the line and feed the line into the currents and let the worm drift down into the holes, and I would catch fish. I'd catch a lot of fish. But then when I fly fished, I did the same thing. Now, my dad, years later, made a concoction of paraffin and gasoline. And the flies I tied were just a hackle around the front of the fly, a fur body, and a tail, a fiber tail, and they were nothing to behold visually. But I would soak them in paraffin and gasoline, that solution, and they floated. And if I could, because there were so many fish and so few fishermen, nobody ever fished these mountain streams. I never saw another guy. Because I said, like in the 40s, like in the war was on, a lot of the population were in the service or working a job during that time to benefit the program, our soldiers, and so there was nobody fishing. And so if I could get the fly to float down there, and I did this, I do again with a flip cast, and I would feed the line into the water, and it would float, the fly would float down into the pool. And there were so many trout that usually the biggest came the firstest because he was in control of the pool. I would get maybe a pretty nice trout. Sometimes I'd get a 9 or a 10-inch brook trout, and they were prizes to behold. But I got a heck of a lot of fish. But then I realized that when the water got low in the summertime, and I was flipping and I was trying to, those fish were gone. When I approached the pool, I could see them go. And lots of times when I approached the pool, I would not only see them go, but the pool above, they were gone. And so I realized that I had to come up with another approach. So I decided I would come in behind them and cast in behind them, and I could catch more fish. But my fly ended up in every rhododendron and every hemlock, and my casting was horrendous because I was using too much of arm. I wasn't getting, and so I learned. I had to learn over time. The arm is out, the wrist is in, and so mountain fishing really helped me with fishing on big streams too, with shortening the casting stroke. And with that shortened casting stroke, you can load the rod so much faster and get distance too with that stroke. And so I learned with an awful lot of frustration how to work a mountain stream.
And these mountain streams, is that where you learned to make bow and arrow cast?
Yes.
Because I have an admission, like I've caught fish on a bow and arrow cast in the jungle. I've caught peacock bass on a bow and arrow cast. I've caught them on spring creeks in Patagonia. And every time there's a fish in front of me and I know I have to use it, I've done it in New Zealand too, every time I think of you because it's kind of a stressful situation. I say, how would Joe Humphreys do this? Because you're the person I learned the bow and arrow cast from. It's kind of an iconic move. So every time I do it, I'm like, what would Joe do?
Oh, you know, like fishing is like, how shall I say this? When you're fishing, you have to you have to adjust. You've got to get that that fly up there, and there's so much brush. I can't make a cast here. What will I do? And so I learned to just pop it. And then in time, I needed distance, and I didn't know how to get distance. And so I learned if I looped the leader and the line, and I could make a bow and arrow head, I shot the loops, and I got distance. And then one time, the only time that George Harvey ever gave me credit, and George was good on a mountain stream, and we were on this mountain stream, and as the line was coming back to me, I reached up, caught it, and shot it. It was a bow and arrow roll cast. And George Harvey said to me, he said, I never saw that. And my head was so big because he gave me credit for that cast. And I thought, oh, George Harvey gave me credit. And so that was a bow and arrow roll cast. And now on some of the films I have coming up now, you'll see it, and it's really a great cast. And so I learned so many techniques, but I learned how to loop the fly line in my hand with a series of loops from George Harvey. On the stream one day, I saw him. I said, "How are you getting distance?" And he didn't tell me. I just watched him, and he did this: 3 fingers, 2 fingers, 3, 2. It's like the hand and twist that you use when you're retrieving your line, fishing wet flies, or fishing nymphs maybe, or fishing streamers. You use the hand and twist to retrieve. And so that's what he was doing. And he had it all in his hand, the whole cast, and he shot it with a bow and arrow. And so I learned that from George. Yeah.
Okay.
Let me tell you a little story. This is a neat story. George Harvey and I were fishing, I think it was Young Woman's Creek. And George said to me, he said, you go upstream and fish down to the bridge. And then you just stay on the bridge and wait for me. I'm going downstream, and I'm going fish up to you. And he says, now, and he was in his 60s then, and he says, I don't wait as fast, and it's going to take me a while to get there, but you just wait on the bridge for me. So I fished down, and I was waiting on the bridge, and pretty soon here he came. And he came up the stream, and he was fishing, and he finally come up to me, and he looked up, and he said to me, boy, those fish sure were easy today, weren't they, Joe? And I said, well, Mr. Harvey, I didn't catch one legal fish. I said, I didn't do very good. I really didn't catch any fish. And he looked at me and he said, neither did I. He was testing me. I could have lied to him. I could have said how many fish I caught. And he was testing me. Is this kid worth fishing with, or is he a BSer?
Yeah. George Harvey lie detector test. I love it.
The George Harvey lie detector test.
That is a great story.
Yeah.
So you're at 90. You mentioned a few minutes ago you're still doing some video projects. 96 years old, and you're still putting together video projects.
Yes. It's it's on brush fishing. Yeah, and I have so many ways of shooting the bow. Yeah.
And all of these are going to be on your website,
Yeah.
joehumphrey'sofficial.com.
Yes, I have the last Monday. I will have the last shoot, and this coming Monday I'll be on the stream for my last time.
And it's a whole video series of like your techniques and advice and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. That's going to be amazing. And people can order your books on the website too?
I guess they can. I don't know.
You're not making the website?
No, I don't know. No.
Another thing, you brought in a pretty special rod today.
I got to tell you, let me tell you a story.
I would love to hear about this.
I wanted a very special fly rod, and I heard of these rods. The Paul H. Young rods were made in Michigan by Paul H. Young, and I ordered the cheapest. I didn't have any money, and I did the best I could. I got $38. I think the rod was $38, and it was the Paul H. Young Prosperity. And when I got that rod, it was a thing of beauty. I thought it was so wonderful, and I never had a rod like it. You know, the Kingfisher rod I had fished with for years with a club when it came right down to it, and I thought this was the most wonderful rod that I'd ever had. So my father and I were fishing Penn's Creek, and we were down below Coburn. And I had this rod. I was ready to really give it a try. And it started to rain, and it poured. And so we fished down about a mile down below Coburn, or we called it the White Riffle, the Great White Riffle. And below the riffle was a big still stretch. And so my dad and I were down there, and down in this still stretch, there's some backwater. There was a deep hole, and 3 guys were fishing there. And when we get down to him, he pulled a sack. He had a gunny sack of trout, and he pulled the trout out to show me. And there were big trout. There were 18, 19, 20-some inch trout in that sack. And I thought, oh my God, I want one of those. And so in my pocket, in my little fishing bag, I had hooks and sinkers and stuff. And I pulled out I took the fly off, and I put a bell sinker on. And then above the bell sinker, I had a hook on a leader. It was a snelled hook on a leader. And I fastened that above that bell sinker. And then I asked one of those guys that was fishing if he'd give me a worm, and he did. And so I made a cast with this Prosperity Paul H. Young rod. And all at once I had a tug, and I set the hook, and I set it really hard. And I had a big sucker. The sucker must have been 20 inches or more. It was a big sucker. And when I got the fish out, and I released the fish, and I had a set in the rod. The rod had a set in it. And I was heartbroken. And so going up that railroad track, I was crying. I cried almost the whole way to the car because I thought I had ruined my Paul H. Young Prosperity rod. But later on, I got the rod straightened out.
And this is that same rod?
Here it is, the same rod.
And what year did you have this?
That rod was bought in the 40s.
Wow.
The Paul H. Young Prosperity. Put it together. Put one of those tips on it. See what it's what I thought was the epitome of a rod back in those days. This was the rod of a lifetime. And
gotta be careful.
Yeah, that'll be all right.
That's it.
Now that's it. Now.
Your rod from the 1940s.
And I thought that was so light and so small and so wonderful. But with the rods today, it's heavy, isn't it? There's weight to it.
Compared to the rods today, yeah.
Yeah, compared to the rods today. Our rods today are so much lighter.
But nostalgia is a huge part of fly fishing, and the memories that you make.
That is it.
This
That's
is tied up with a
nostalgia.
lifetime of fishing, so
Yes.
it's more special than anything
That's
that could be
special.
turned out of a factory right now, because it's got all the memories and stuff wrapped up in it, and that's
Yes.
what fly
Oh,
fishing's
boy.
really all about, is the memories. And
memories.
I love talking to you how you remember like the little dewdrops on the grass and the rock people were standing on in 1937, and all of the little details that stand out in your mind.
One little story I have for you, and I remember it so well. And Fisherman's Paradise was the first all fly fishing project in the United States, and it was very popular because there were so many big fish. And I have two stories to tell you. And so I pedaled my bicycle from State College. That's 10 miles. And I got down there, and this was on the first day. It was May the 15th. That's when it opened, and it closed August the 31st. And it opened at 9 o'clock in the morning, but I didn't get there till 10 o'clock. And there was a long line waiting to get in to register. You had to register, and they signed you. You had a card, and they gave you a big button. And so I finally got registered, and there wasn't any place to fish. It was shoulder to shoulder. And so I saw an elderly man standing on a rock, and the rock was slanted. And so I said to myself, that guy can't stand there that long. So I ran in behind him and sat down and waited. And finally, he jumped off the rock, and I jumped on. That's how crowded it was. In 1 mile of stream that day, there were 3,000 fishermen. So the thing about Fisherman's Paradise, they stocked it maybe twice a week. There were so many big fish, and everybody that fished, most of the people were fishing streamers. Phillips Fly Tackle Company in Alexandria, Pennsylvania, which George Harvey was in charge of the fly tying, and he had several ladies tying flies for the Phillips Fly Tying Company. And they made one streamer called a weasel. It was a lead head with flank feathers. Some were green, some were red, some were brown. They had all different colors of this weasel. And so that was one of the flies they fished. And another fly that Harvey came up with was a squirrel's tail streamer. And that was popular. But there were a lot of streamers, and there were big fish there, and people were after them. And one thing that happened, on Sundays, you were not permitted to fish on Sundays. So people would go to the footbridge or the big bridge that the cars could cross, and they would feed these big fish bread, and the big fish would come up like crazy for this bread. So on Monday, when fishing started again at 9 o'clock in the morning, guys tied white deer hair flies and clipped them to look like breadcrumbs. And when that whistle blew to start the fishing, guys on both sides of the stream were flailing those big bread flies.
They blew a whistle to begin the fishing?
Those big deer hair flies. And those big trout came up for them. Can you imagine 3 or 4 guys hooking fish below those bridges on those deer hair cropped flies that looked like bread? And those big fish were like, they were 24 inches, 22 inches, 26 inches. Those big fish were hooked and going wild. Can you imagine fishermen on both sides of the stream. What a heck of a mess that was.
Absolute mayhem.
It was mayhem. What a major tangle. And there was a lot of bad language going on at that time. So I remember this. And so one thing that I remember, that these deer hair bread flowers and the minnows and the streamers that most people fish, but the people did not understand, basically, because I had fished Spring Creek all of my life, and I knew that the deer hair or the freshwater shrimp and the crest bugs was the mainstay of their diet. So I tied a fox fur. I told you about that fox fur nymph. So I kind of did better with my fox fur nymphs, but I still did the fox fur, but I went to a smaller hook. I went to an 18, and now I just pulled the fibers down, clipped them, they look like legs. I had a little tail, but I had above that fly, maybe a foot above the fly, I had a little bit of wraparound lead, just a couple of, maybe 3 or 4 twists. And I would see a fish, and you could see them back in there. There were so many fish. And I would spot a trout, and I would make a cast of just above that fish and watch that trout. And when that trout opened his mouth and closed it, I set the hook. And I caught fish after fish. Now, all of these people on that stream were fishing like crazy, not catching. And I was catching fish after fish. And so when I would make a cast, they would cast over my line. 3 or 4 guys would cast over my line, trying to catch that line to see what I was fishing. And when they did that, I would pull my line out. And then when I would catch a fish, people would run in to see what I was using, and I would get the fly out of the fish as quick as I could, put it into the palm of my hand, and go up the stream with it, get away from the people. And the people followed me. It was like I was like the Pied Piper on a trout stream. I had people following me to see what that fly was. And I never did show it to anybody. I kept that fly a secret. And then one day, many, many, many years later, I was working with the veterans in Virginia on the Rose River and helping these veterans catch fish. And a man came up to me at the end of the day in this pavilion. This man came up to me and he said, "You're Joe Humphreys." And I said, "Yes." He said, "I will never forget you." He said, "You did something for me that I'll never forget." He said, "We were at Fisherman's Paradise, and my father had fished all day, and he couldn't catch anything, and I couldn't catch anything, and we were so frustrated. And I asked you, could you help my father catch a fish? And you gave him a fly, and he caught 4 trout. He caught 4 trout. He never forgot. He said, that was the greatest day in my life, and I thank you for that. And so that technique with that little fly way back then, I did help somebody.
You helped thousands and thousands of people with your presentations, your seminars, your articles, your books, and all of your teaching at Penn State and teaching everywhere, and you're still teaching today.
You never realize how many people, Ross, you yourself meet so many people. You fish for so long. You've met so many people on the stream. You have done exactly what I have done. Mr. Purnell, you have been a teacher. You have been a guide to so many people. You have made their day. You have given them a day in the stream they'll never forget. And
Well,
they thank
you.
you for that. You're not just a publisher of a magazine. You are an excellent fly fisherman. I fished with you. I know how good you are.
Thank you.
And you are
That's amazing for you to say that.
a superb fly fisherman that have helped so many. And you are helping so many people with your magazine, with so much good information and so much how-to that people pick up with. In my book, maybe I've helped some people as they read about different techniques and how you do this with wet flies or how to make the proper cast. Let me give you another story. I'm going to give you a couple of stories. I'm with George Harvey on, I think we were fishing Spring Creek. And he said to me, he saw a trout rise, and he said to me, he says, "That's your fish. You take them." And at that time, I think I was in my 20s, and I thought there might have been a better fisherman in the United States, but I doubted it. I thought I was just about number one. And George saw this in me. So he said to me, he says, "You catch that fish." So I made the cast over, and I said, "I'll catch this fish." So I made the cast over the trout. The trout come up to the fly and followed it and disappeared. So I said, "I'll catch this fish." So I made another cast, and the trout looked at the fly, followed it, and disappeared. Before I could make the next cast, George stepped around behind me, made one cast, and caught that trout. And I said to myself, "Damn." I said, "It was the fly that caught that fish. You had the right fly." He says, "No." He said, "Look at your fly. I'm going to show you my fly. We're both fishing a deer hair ant. Here, look at my fly. Let me see yours. It's the same fly." He says, "Now just remember this. You don't know anything. You don't know anything about fishing at all." He said, "From now on, you keep your mouth shut and listen to what I tell you." And then he showed me how, from that day on, how to make a slack leader cast, how you stop the rod high. The rod comes down, your leader, the tippet is 30 inches longer. Maybe it's 30 some inches long. And you stop that rod high, and the rod comes down before the fly does. The rod comes down, the fly comes down later, and you have all these soft curves of leader on the water. And by the time the currents pick up all that leader, that fly is going at a natural speed with the currents. And you have a drag-free drift, and that's how you catch fish.
Brilliant.
A lesson well learned.
You learned from a master and became a master, and now you're passing it along.
So we're on a trout stream, and I think it might have been the Lycoming Creek. And he said, "You're a left-hander. I'm a right-hander. I'll go up the right side of the stream, and you go up the left hand." And he was catching fish. And he caught 5 fish to every 1 fish I was catching. And I was so frustrated. But I was catching fish. I think I caught just enough that I wasn't totally ashamed, but I was ashamed because he was really outfishing me. So when we got together again, back to the car, I said, "You caught a lot of fish, George." He said, "Yes, I did." And I said, "How did you do it?" And he says, "I noticed when we started fishing, you were using a small rod. You were using a 7-foot rod. And I was using an 8-foot rod. And he said, I could hold my line above the water longer, and I would give my flies in the productive area a much longer drift because I could lift that much more line above the water and give me time enough for a natural drift, where your fly, when you made a cast, your fly was there for a moment and then the currents pulled it out of there. And so the secret today was, the reason I caught more fish was because I had a long enough rod to lift over all of the currents to give me a drag-free drift. And my leader.
And now people are fishing 10 and 11-foot rods to do the same kind of thing, but that's hard to do. Fish a 10 or 11-foot bamboo rod back in the day.
Yeah.
But yeah, it goes back to your original point. Line control is everything, and adapting, managing your line, and getting it.
Have you had enough stories for me today?
Never enough, but I think the card might run out of memory space, so I don't want it to turn off automatically.
One more thing I might add is that one day when, and this is one thing that I might be proud of, that I think that I helped save Spring Creek. And at one time when they changed the highway, they took the beautiful Thompson Spring, which gave Spring Creek life, and they pulled the spring right into the duck pond, was a storm sewer runoff with all the filth of State College in it, and the water warmed up, and all of that water was flowing into Spring Creek, and Spring Creek was warming up, and it was killing the insect population, and it was destroying Spring Creek. And I said, I've got to divert that big spring around that duck pond. It can't go in there. And with 5 guys, my friends, I got them around the table at my house because I knew I couldn't do it alone, and we formed Trout Unlimited, the Spring Creek section. And so I went to the head of the physical plant. His name was Mr. Brown, and he was such a nice person, and he realized what I wanted to do, and it just so happened at the time that they were dredging the duck pond to make it deeper for more water. And they had big stone piers with their big machinery out there digging, and the foreman, his name was Whitey. And I said to him, we need to get a hole through this concrete and to get a pipe through to divert the spring around. We gotta. So he brought a backhoe in, dug out where I asked him to dig out, where we could divert the water around the duck pond, and he dug it out, and then 3 of us were down in there with a jackhammer, and we punched a hole out, and I went to a guy, his name was, it's slipping me, but I went to a friend that had the stone quarry in Oak Hall, and he gave me a big piece of pipe that I asked for, and he said, where do you want it? And I told him, and he delivered it right there where we had just punched a hole out of that concrete. And so we put the pipe in. And so we finally diverted all of that spring water. Paul Blankenhorn and did such a great job in helping, and all of us, we worked together, and we got the job done. And Whitey, with his backhoe, came down and helped dig the trench for the water to flow in. and made the diversion between the road and the pond. And today, with the Hawbaker Company and Whitey, we have now completed a wonderful project, and the water is now flowing into Spring Creek as it did years ago, and Spring Creek made a comeback.
That's amazing that you preserved the creek that had given so much to you over so many decades.
That's what I felt. I had so much love, and it gave me my life, and it gave me my happiness, and it gave me so much information, a love of fly fishing. I wasn't about to see it go.
I think it's pretty beautiful that you're not only teaching people how to fish, but teaching people how to protect our natural resources. If we don't have these places to fish, nothing else really matters, right? If we don't have the rivers, the flies and rods and stuff like that don't matter much. The most important thing is protecting the rivers and protecting the water quality.
Do you know what I think is so wonderful today? In the classrooms, now they have trout in the classrooms, and they have the eggs, and they watch the progression of a trout coming from an egg into a fish.
Yeah.
And they raise these fish, but they are learning not only about the fishery, about the fish, they're learning about conservation and the protection of our streams. And this is our future. Yeah.
It is our future.
I wish I would have had that when I was in the classroom.
Well, there's a lot you passed along, and I think your work on Spring Creek is a great legacy to a lifetime of work.
Well,
so thanks for coming in. I hope I wish all the stories you were telling about Penn's Creek, I remember I ran into you on Penn's Creek just a couple of years ago. We were out both fishing the sulfur hatch and just ran into each other. So I hope we run into each other on Penn's Creek
again. And I'm going to give you a tip.
Okay.
Okay. I'm fishing the green drake with Denny Shannon on Penn's Creek. And you got to realize that at the time, the sulfur hatch had been on for 3 weeks. It came on before Memorial Day. It came on in May, mid-May. And so we had, say, 3 weeks of sulfur hatching. And now the green drake is on. And people are lying on both sides of the stream. And they're waiting for the trout to rise on the green drake. And once in a while, a trout would rise, and 5 lines would go over, the flies would go over that fish. And everybody was just waiting for that hatch to go. And meanwhile, Denny Shannon and I are catching fish after fish. And finally somebody yells, "You're catching a lot of fish up there." And we said, "Yes, we are." And he says, and we were fishing the sulfur nymph. I had a pair on, he had a pair on, and they were really tied into that sulfur nymph because they had been feeding on it for 3 weeks. And that's what they were conditioned to.
They were trained, yeah.
They were trained, they were conditioned. So they yelled, "What are you using?" And we said, "The green drake." And so when that hatch starts to come on and the fish aren't really doing that much, just fish the sulfur nymph. Yeah.
That is a good tip. I love it.
Okay.
Thanks again for coming in, Joe.
God
appreciate it. Before we close up, just remind people how they can get in touch with you. Joe Humphreys Official.com is your website. They can get the books and video and stay in touch. And I hope there's more coming, Joe. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And it was so nice to be with you.